Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Simon van Durpen, and I'm a reporter in Politico's Competition and Industrial Policy team. EU Competition Chief Margrethe Vestager in September announced that the European Commission is looking for ways to adapt competition enforcement to better support the objective of the Green Deal. This echoes the Dutch and Greek competition authorities' initiatives to adjust competition rules to help companies embrace Europe's climate neutrality objectives by 2050. This is a bit of a revolution for the competition community, which is sometimes described as relatively conservative and isolated. Even if the letter of the EU treaties allows authorities to embrace different EU policy objectives, competition enforcement has traditionally focused on practices affecting consumer prices, although there are a broader number of considerations sometimes taken into account. Today, we would like to explore to what extent the urgency of the climate crisis, as reflected in the Commission's priorities, could or should also influence the Competition Department's review of state aid, mergers, and cooperation agreements, and what impact that may have not only on the climate, but also on competition and innovation and on employment. But before doing so, I would like to share some housekeeping remarks with you. We would like to thank our partner, Business Science Poland, for making the virtual event possible, and all our viewers for joining online. You can participate in the event by tweeting about it at POLITICO Events and asking questions via Slido using hashtag #CompGreenDeal for both platforms. If you are following us from the event website, Slido is embedded below the live stream window. If you are following us from Facebook or Twitter, go to Slido from your computer or phone and use the hashtag #CompGreenDeal to ask your questions. To show you how it works, please log into Slido now, and you should see this poll. The question is, what tool can the European Commission's Competition Department best use to steer the climate policy? And you should see the options indicated. And now, before we get started, here's a word from Bartek Cicerski, the Managing Director of Business Science Poland. Over to you, Bartek.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to the distinguished speakers and other participants who watch us in this moment. Yes, Business and Science Poland connects the experience of leading Polish enterprises and of the research and development community with the European Union. We represent the knowledge and interests of leading entities which employ around 150,000 employees in Poland, in the EU and globally. We are committed to advancing the values of the European common market, and we also acknowledge the need to transform it responsibly and effectively. Therefore, we are pleased to be able to contribute to this timely debate. We just learned a few moments ago that Vice President Vestager in February will convene a conference on the very subject that we are discussing today. It is our shared objective to make a successful transition to a climate neutral economy and to the responsible future. We all agree that the question is not if, but how to do it. Responsible means that the businesses and societies need tools to get there. We also sense the scale of this challenge, not only in terms of financial and regulatory efforts, but also in terms of changing habits and attitudes. We speak from a particular perspective of the economy, which made quite recently, it started only 30 years ago, a successful transition to a market economy. This transformation efforts continues. Since 1990, the EU has managed to reduce its total CO2 emissions by 23%, largely thanks to reductions in the Central European countries. But in many industrial sectors, which we represent, we reach the limit of the emissions reductions enabled by the laws of nature. To achieve the Green Deal goals, apart from wise regulations, we will need also a vast amount of sustainable investments in order to build new technologies and to secure the transition. We are talking about spending 260 billion euro yearly by 2030 in order to reach our climate ambitions. Of course, funding is needed from private investors, and the taxonomy has a role to play, but the support of public resources will also be necessary. However, we should wisely consider how to allow state aid to support this environmental transition, taking into account different starting points and different capacities in various parts of Europe. I see at least 3 points where competition policy is highly relevant for this transition. One example is electrification, which is an essential part of the EU decarbonization efforts. Energy is the key cost factor for the EU industry and for many future investment decisions. The challenge is to ensure that electricity in the EU remains globally competitive, affordable, and available to the demanded quantities during the transition to renewable resources. Therefore, the state aid guidelines for ETS and for environmental protection energy have an important role to play in this regard. Secondly, the EU decarbonization policy so far has focused on the production process side to reduce greenhouse emissions. Now, policymakers need to examine more closely how to create a market for low carbon products. Here, competition policy will also be instrumental. Thirdly, we don't act in isolation. Other global players are joining the decarbonization race, which in itself is good. They also create conditions for green investments. Some offer big markets and economy of scale. They also direct significant public funds to new technologies and in creating new markets. All this might not only attract investments away from Europe, those companies will also compete with us on the EU soil. We're not afraid of fair competition, but the EU must ensure that the level playing field and that our high standards, including state aid rules, are applicable also to our international partners. Therefore, I'm very much looking forward to hearing the distinguished panelists addressing those and probably other issues at the intersection of the Green Deal and the competition policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bartek, for joining us this afternoon. Before we move to our panel discussion, I would like to kindly remind you that you can participate in this event by tweeting about it at POLITICO Events and ask questions via Slido using hashtag CompGreenDeal for both platforms. So I am joined online by, in alphabetical order, Nicole Carr, a partner in Linklater's global competition practice, who led on over 40 significant merger control investigations before the European and UK authorities, and is also a highly regarded cartel specialist. Marek Niedrzak is Under-Secretary of State in the Polish Ministry of Entrepreneurship, Labour and Technology. Maarten Pieters Hinkle is a professor of competition economics and regulation at the University of Amsterdam. His research interests are in industrial organization and competition policy, with a particular focus on cartel behavior. And last but not least, Alexander Winterstein is currently head of unit at the European Commission's Director General for Competition, where he oversees the consultation process on the role of competition policy in support of the European Green Deal. Welcome, everyone. So the idea is to have an interactive discussion. Please do wave should you want to jump in or react to each other's interventions. Alexander, let me begin with you. Could you briefly outline what is top of the agenda right now for the Commission's Competition Department when it comes to supporting the Green Deal? Margrethe Vestager said in a speech today that the European Commission received almost 200 responses to its consultation that was finalized on November 20th. Could you share potentially some insights about that feedback? Thank you. I have a problem hearing Alexander. I don't know if that is the same for...
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better. That's
excellent. Better. Simon, I'll do that with pleasure. I think the Executive Vice President has replied also to a question that you have posed, or a statement that you have made at the very beginning, which is whether competition law is facing or should be going through a revolution. And I think she was very clear about the goals and the basic ambitions of competition policy, which have brought so much benefits, not only to the European economy, but also to the implementation of sustainable policies so far, should not be changed. the benefits that we have seen and the benefits that have led to very effective sustainable policies up to now should be preserved. And if anything, then the enforcement will be as vigorous, even more vigorous than it has been so far. So at the same time, she has said also today that what we are looking for is not so much a revolution, as you put it, or a reset, as others have said, but more a reboot, which is a concept that we know from the movie industry, where old movies are brought back into life, so to speak, with characters and plot lines that we know, but with adaptations to times that have changed, to make them up to date and relevant for today. And that's exactly what we are doing with regard to the competition rules. You know that there are a number of reviews ongoing. Certainly the other panelists will be very much aware of that, and also all the people who are listening to us. I don't need to mention that. And most recently, what the Executive Vice President has launched is the public consultation that you mentioned. And indeed, we have received a high number of contributions, slightly below 200, from a very broad range of contributors from all over Europe. I have some statistics for you that I can share at this moment. Not surprisingly, and I think that also fits with the chart, the Slido chart that you showed at the very beginning, with the emphasis on state aid. State aid was also the area where most contributions came in, slightly above 40% of all contributions dealt with state aid, and about around 1/3 with antitrust, and slightly less, about 20-25% with mergers. And I think that very much reflects also what people have expected. Then, in terms of who has replied, also there I have some statistics. We have seen the biggest part of contributors, above 1/3, comes from associations, from business associations, industry associations, and others. And I think that is not surprising, because these associations have a very good view about the concerns, challenges, but also the opportunities that each of these sectors and parts of industry are facing. Followed by above 20%, I would say, companies and other representations of industry. Also, this I don't think is surprising. And then you have the next group of people, next group of recipients, evenly distributed amongst academics, lawyers, authorities, and competition authorities. So not only competition authorities have replied, also a fair number of other authorities have chipped in. And then you have a number of other categories as well. And finally, as regard to the geographic distribution of respondents, you will not be surprised that many of them, almost 1/3, have their seat in Belgium. But that is, of course, because many associations have their seat here. For the rest, you see a geographic spread that you would expect with the big member states, Germany, France, Italy, being, so to speak, in front with most contributions. The UK has sent in also a significant number of contributions, and the Netherlands, which of course I think reflects also the particular interest of our topic in academic and industry circles in the Netherlands. But there we have authoritative panel members who will then be able to say more about this. So I would leave it here. Happy to answer further questions if you have any.
Thank you, Alexander. Let me turn now to Marek Nieduzak, who is joining us from Warsaw, I presume. Marek, how do you evaluate the initiatives to integrate sustainability into the competition law analysis that could, in the field of state aid, for example, make it more difficult to invest in sectors with a high carbon footprint?
Well, let me say this, that, I think it's quite obvious that we need to ask a more general question here, why we have competition rules in the first place. And I think we have them because we want to protect fair competition and we want to protect consumers. Now, and if you believe, as I think most of us do believe, that it's the market mechanism that is the most efficient way of, producing things, distributing goods, then I think you have to admit that if we have competition law that protects consumers and free competition, then this is the optimal system. It doesn't necessarily have to translate directly into environmental protection, if I could say so. It doesn't mean that it has no role to play, because I guess in some cases there is a role for competition rules to be played. For instance, I guess a more flexible application of certain concentration rules could contribute to easier integration of value chains, and the shorter value chains, the smaller environmental footprint. So what I want to say is this: that I think I shared the same idea that we don't need to revolutionize present system competition law, because it is as Alexander said, we see that it's profitable. It has profited the European economy and European consumers in many ways. So I would say generally, or in general, I totally agree with that perspective. My point is that maybe in some cases, a little bit more flexible approach can help us to achieve, let's say, green transformation or a more sustainable economy in European countries.
Thank you, Marek. Let me now turn to Nicole Carr, to the question of cooperation between competitors, a topic that usually falls under the EU's strict cartel rules. The Dutch and Greek competition authorities have issued guidance for companies who want to cooperate on sustainability objectives. How do you evaluate those initiatives, and where do you draw the line between cooperation that is okay and cooperation that is not?
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, I think competition policy has two roles to play in this debate. One is to prevent companies from colluding to prevent green initiatives that would be in the public interest. So I think we've seen various bits of enforcement against the German car manufacturers in terms of allegedly stopping innovations in relation to emissions. We've seen some older enforcement in consumer detergents when people were, acting together under the auspices of an environmental policy. So there's definitely a prevention role that competition policy has to play. I think there's also an enabling role. And that's really where the importance of the Dutch and Greek papers, and I think the UK will have a paper, and also the French authority a paper, are really important here, because Alexander mentioned, this is a reboot in the movie industry. I think the movie might be Back to the Future, because, back in 2000, the Commission took really quite an enlightened view on thinking about efficiencies and environmental efficiencies in its CECD decision in washing machines, so allowing the phasing out of energy inefficient washing machines. And there the Commission really talked about the collective benefit. There was going to be an increased cost to these machines, but they would have a collective benefit to society that was 7 times what the increased price would be. And the Commission took this wider view of the benefit going beyond those who purchased the machines, but to society as a whole, to help reduce pollution. And the horizontal guidelines at that time also had a chapter on sustainability that was closer to what the Commission actually did in that CECD case. I think since then, we've seen the horizontal guidelines has dropped that chapter, and many of us are pushing again for that chapter to go back in and having a bit of a framework really for thinking more about the balancing of greater society benefits like less pollution, less emissions, etc., carbon neutralization or zero carbon by 2050 or even 2030, against restrictions of competition. And I think what's lost a bit in the competition debate in the last decade or so has been that balancing of wider social benefit against possible competition harm. And I know Martin Peter will have something to say about that, but I think the Dutch proposal is a really fantastic framework for thinking about these kinds of dilemmas. You know, there are many things that don't infringe competition law. Let's give companies the confidence to pursue those collaborations that don't breach the law. Then there are some that could breach the law. Let's talk about how we think about whether or not they're good for society, how we measure those, what's the right framework for that. I think the Dutch have taken a really progressive and an interesting view of fair share to consumers in the efficiency sections of the treaty. And, you know, I think we should have a lot of academic and other discussion about the right framework, but, you know, it's a really good step in the right direction. And we then wait to see what the Commission makes of this close to 200 submissions and also the Dutch approach, so we can have a coherent European framework.
Thanks, Nicole. Martin Peter, let me turn to you before tackling some of the questions that already come in. I believe you have a slightly different views than Nicole's. Could you perhaps react and explain why?
Yes, thank you. I can. So thanks for having me on this event. Actually, I was one of the people that responded also to the consultation amongst the academics, I suppose, and I'm glad to see the analogy with films, because I submitted a lecture, actually a recorded lecture, because of time constraints. Now, yes, I'm very critical of this Dutch approach. The Dutch have been forerunning in this regard, so I've had some time to think about it already a couple of years now. And there is a big concern, I think, underlying this policy. But let me first say, of course, that the objective is extremely important. And certainly the focus on environmental damage, fight against climate change, super important, and a great urgency also to it. And there is a big government failure in solving these problems. But the question is whether competition law then would be the fix. And ultimately, when we are talking about allowing horizontal agreements with anti-competitive effects for maybe some supposed sustainability benefits that they may do, then we are creating a market imperfection, if you like, to fix the government failure to repair the real market imperfection, which is that there are externalities, that firms pollute too much because they can do so without pricing it in, and so on. So I think we should, instead of going down this route, we should go and look for real government solutions. So we should rather lobby the government rather than the competition authority to agree to allow horizontal agreements with anti-competitive effects. And the reason is ultimately this. Now, of course, we have three things on the agenda. We have the state aid. I think that's the easiest one in a way. We still have to be careful there whether companies are really sincere, but nevertheless, that's where I think the government has an important role. And so state aid would certainly be an area where we can contribute a lot. Mergers is already a different matter. So if we are looking at mergers, it makes perfect sense from an economic point of view to take sustainability benefits into account in the efficiency defense. I think we can do that. We can use environmental economics. But we should not so much expect mergers to create incentives to do more sustainability investments, to produce more sustainably over competition. Because, and that's where the hot debate is, when we look at the literature about the fundamental underlying premise of the, let's call it green cartel policy, that fundamental underlying premise is that somehow the tension between competition and environment is loosened, is relaxed if you would relax competition. Now, we know that in markets there's pollution because of externality problems. And so there's a classic public economic public economics matter of externalities that can be solved by copyrights, property rights, or taxation and so on. There's a whole literature with Nobel Prize winners like Samuelson and Coase. But what we are here having as a premise now underlying this policy is the idea that to solve this tension between competition and environment, that we should somehow relax competition. We should somehow create market power, and that's going to solve this tension. And there's really no evidence in the economics literature for this premise at all. So if you look at the literature, it's not a very extensive literature that's directly about sustainability matters. But if you look at what is there, and there's some empirical literature, for example, a recent paper by Aguillon and others that was just put out, theoretical papers, a few, some papers in the business realm, so in business studies, then what these papers show is that it's rather competition. Exposure to competition, for example, when import duties are lowered, that creates incentives for companies, for corporations to do more green. Whenever the corporation is a little bit interested in this green, because, for example, there's a little bit of willingness to pay with consumers for it, or there's some intrinsic motivation for that matter with the companies, then in competition, there's a stronger drive for them to go and invest in sustainable product than when they are allowed to talk about it. So when we're going to allow them to talk about it and give these exemptions, we should actually expect them to do less rather than more, because it eliminates this dimension of competition on the green. So therefore, I'm skeptical because I underline the important objective of the whole affair. It's very sympathetic, but this is exactly the wrong mechanism. I think it will lead rather, and when we're talking about collusion, then this is going to rather lead to less green than more.
Alexander, maybe let me turn to you. I know the Commission at this stage is hesitant to tranche any of these questions, but could you offer perhaps some reflections on this debate about cooperation between competitors?
Well, let me do something which perhaps is not super polite, but I'm going to it anyway, Simon. And this is to draw the attention to the conference that we will be organizing on the 4th of February with Executive Vice President Vestager, with Frans Timmermans, also with Kadri Simpson, our Energy Commissioner, CEOs. We'll have MEPs there. Professor Aguillon was just mentioned. He will be there as well. There will be lawyers, academics. We even managed to bring Nicole Carr to our conference as well. And so why I'm saying this is because this conference, with those high-level speakers, will do exactly what you asked me to do now. They will take a look at all these issues, at all these questions. They will benefit from the close to 200 contributions that we have received. And so altogether, we will see whether we can draw some conclusions from this for the way forward. So I think the date to pencil in is the 4th of February. And that also means that right now I will not be able to really take a position other than that everything that I have heard from the panelists is also being reflected in the contributions that we have seen. Some topics a bit more, other topics a bit less. We've really seen a very, very broad range of opinion on those and many other conflictual, or let's say interesting and intellectually stimulating issues. So really we have, I think, covered, not we, the contributors have covered an enormous amount of ground. There's a lot of things to read. We are actually in the process of digesting these contributions. And so I look forward to, and I hope that everybody else will also look forward to the 4th of February conference, where we'll try to bring all these strands together and hopefully be able to draw some lessons for the future.
Thank you, Alexander. You have clearly still been in the communications department of the European Commission. May I still turn to Nicole before perhaps we turn to the state aid topic, but did you still want to briefly respond to what Martin Peter just said?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can probably agree on some points. I mean, I think the danger in this area is generalization. So I think you can probably divide the world into those areas where consumers are willing to pay for green products and pay more for green products, and they're willing to pay at a level that funds the investment needed. Bartek mentioned, the 260 billion euros per annum needed to achieve the 2030 net zero aspiration requires the private sector to feel confident about what it can and can't do by way of collaborating with competitors. And I think, what Martin Peter is describing in terms of markets where there is a willingness to pay, the consumer will cover the tab, companies will absolutely compete for that capital because it will enhance their own position. And that in that area, competition probably is the better answer. However, there's a big area where it isn't efficient for companies to do things unilaterally. They won't do things unilaterally because the investment required is too big, or there's a first mover disadvantage. So they expend the cost and others free ride on their efforts. And where actually the scale of the initiative required is so great that it requires big companies to team up in a way that the current competition rules would prevent. And I think we've done such a good job as a sector, the private sector, telling people about the risks they run in infringing competition rules up to 10% of global turnover if you breach the EU rules, that there's real hesitation, and we can argue whether it's real or whether it's not, but hesitation to try and collaborate to achieve green initiatives. And so where there isn't willingness to pay, and there's any number of demand side problems, which mean customers aren't willing to pay, or they engage in very common consumer biases like hyperbolic discounting, assuming that the climate change impacts will not be as bad as they will be, or assuming that someone else will fund the investments, where those kinds of willingness to pay issues mean that you don't really see consumer funding green initiatives. I think there is a real need to think about, well, how can we enable via competition policy? It's not the only instrument. It may not even be the most important instrument, but how do we at least prevent companies assuming wrongly that they can't collaborate to achieve a green initiative, which ultimately a competition agency needs to consider and might bless because it benefits society as a whole. Now, I agree with Martin Peter. Let's not say everything is fine or everything is bad. Actually, there's quite a big grey zone. But let's at least develop the framework for trying to distinguish between a bad initiative and a good initiative, because frankly, we need the private sector to fund this plan, which is in the benefit of everybody if it can be achieved.
Okay, Martin Peter, I saw you raising your hand. Perhaps if you could round it up in a minute or so, that would be great. Yep.
So it's great that we are going to have a conference about it. We need to have a very good interaction between lawyers and economists on this point, because so far the debate is very much held from the point of view of lawyers. And this idea that the willingness to pay would need to be big enough for the cost to be covered is wrong. The point is that if there's a little bit of willingness to pay, then the incentives are bigger in competition than in coordination. And so the only case that would make some sense would be this first mover disadvantage idea, which also the Dutch Competition Authority mentions a lot. But when you think about it, that's a very, very rare situation where you would also, so then there would be no willingness to pay, or there would be no possibility for the companies to maybe differentiate their product with some green in it. Now, if that would be this very extreme case would be there, you would also wonder why companies would start doing something when they are cooperatively doing it, because there's simply no profit for them in it. So we have to be extremely skeptical, and then if those very extreme cases happen, then regulation is the appropriate route, because, and then I'll close on this, but because there's a real risk of greenwashing, of abuse of this policy, because competition law is a very general law. So if you go and stretch these compensation requirements, as the Dutch Competition Authority has done, if you're going to open up for these kinds of initiatives by not compensating consumers anymore with the green that's being produced, but being satisfied with compensation of all the people, which means effectively that the consumers of the product in question are not getting a fair share in the sense of a fully compensating share, but the small share would be, if there's no willingness to pay, would even be a zero share because they don't care for the green in that case. If you open up competition law that wide for these very, very specific cases that could be dealt with much better, in a much better way by government regulation, I think that is dangerous.
Thank you. Now I wanted to turn to the topic of state aid, and Marek Nieduzak, I wanted to ask you because I mean, obviously, I think the pandemic has not really been dropped very often during this discussion, but there's a big recovery effort ahead of us, and as Alexander already mentioned, the European Commission is also consulting on a number of state aid guidelines to review them, the EEAG guidelines, but also ETS guidelines. But how does the Polish government view this issue of state aid, and if you perhaps could also mention the role of employment and some of the sectors in Poland. I believe some of the biggest businesses in Poland are in the oil and gas industry or in the mining sector, which are all quite energy intensive. So, what do you expect from the European Commission in terms of state aid policy?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, one of our biggest companies do belong to energy-intensive sectors, and I think it would be just and fair to find a mechanism or a framework to help them. Because naturally, a transformation or greening of these sectors will take time, and it will take costs, and also social costs, because if we think about areas that are coal dependent or used to be coal dependent, these are often areas which need all sorts of help, and I don't mean only help that's aimed at businesses and companies. So we do believe that reconstruction after the pandemic doesn't need. I mean, can be conducted, can be organized in line with the green transition, but it will require huge investment efforts everywhere. And I think it will be even the cost or this effort will be even bigger in countries that have a lot of businesses depending on traditional technologies. Often, some of those companies will not be able to modernize or invest. If you look at those investments strictly commercially, they will need help. They will need some sort of assistance, and we believe that public funding can play a key role in driving research, creating innovative landscape, in helping those companies to adjust and change in order to become part of green economy. That is also important, not only if you look at sectors, but also if you look at the size. Yeah, again, a lot of companies in countries like Poland are SMEs. And of course, SMEs, it's natural, I would say, for them that it will be more difficult for them to invest in R&D. It will be capital, is just in a natural way. It will be more expensive for them to get access to capital. So again, they will depend on state aid to a far larger extent than bigger companies. So I would say keywords here would be well-constructed, tailor-made, adequate, but also just, especially that the same goals are set for all member states.
Thank you, Marek. One more on state aid for Alexander before we turn to the questions from the audience, and I see we have quite some. Thank you for that. Alexander, I believe every time there's a COVID wave, there seems to be a wave also of state aid notifications. I was wondering, now that the vaccine is coming up, but obviously also the recovery packages are coming up. Can we expect, or does the Commission expect a third notification wave? And do you, how does the Commission intend to deal with this state aid in the recovery phase? I believe the Commissioner already mentioned that there would be templates. Yes, could you perhaps expand a bit on that?
Yeah, well, you're right to mention these enormous numbers that we've been dealing with. You will remember that within a week of the WHO, having declared Europe the epicenter of the pandemic, we have adopted a state aid framework, which we have adapted 4 times since, on the basis of which we have taken, I think, some 350 decisions dealing with more than 400 national measures. And I think that was very important. It was very important to provide that certainty in this very period of a severe economic downturn. And now we are moving into the recovery phase. Well, of course, as you know, that depends on certain other developments outside the field of competition. But the idea, of course, also within the recovery package is that state aid should also be subject to stated rules for very good reasons, because let's not forget what stated rules are there to achieve. They are there to achieve that money is invested wisely, that it brings a very good return for society, that doesn't distort competition, it doesn't distort the level playing field. It has achieved that in the past, and I think at no point in time is it more necessary for this to achieve than right now when we are attempting this recovery. And so the Commission will do everything it can, and DG Competition, of course, in particular, to provide the necessary guidance. The templates you have already mentioned. Of course, there are block exemption regulations that could also apply and exempt most of them. Many measures may not be stated at all, if they're general measures, non-selective measures, or measures aiming at individuals. But when there are stated measures that would need to be notified, then we stand ready, and I can commit to that, that we will be as fast as possible to get these measures off the ground and to the companies that need the money.
Thank you, Alexander. On the third tool of DG Competition, namely the merger review, I wanted to ask Nicole, do your arguments about green cooperation agreements also apply to mergers? And what types of deals or which sectors do you think will be particularly concerned in this regard?
I mean, I do think there is a read across from Article 1013. I mean, I think if you take the view that a fair share to consumers, that requirement in Article 1013 could compensate a wider class of consumers than just those affected by the market, that also has a read across to merger control, because I think Article 2 of the EUMR is really on very similar terms. I think, though, the Commission is thinking somewhat differently about merger control and out-of-market efficiencies and Article 1013, possibly. I mean, we'll see next year. I mean, I do think that there is a real issue with efficiencies and how efficiencies are thought about just generally in merger control. I mean, there isn't really so much an environmental problem as there is an efficiencies problem in merger control. But I think you have to distinguish between, would we say that you should clear a deal that creates huge green benefits but is ultimately very bad for society? Well, not necessarily. It's a weighing exercise. But if we're not even giving any credit for out-of-market efficiencies, that weighing doesn't even take place. So a little bit depends on what you're talking about. But I do think, the airline sector, transport sector, energy sector, some of this huge phase out that's going to be needed of excess capacity, of coal and polluting industries is going to require competition agencies to come up with a toolkit that lets them at least understand what the environmental benefits might be. They may choose to ignore them, but it would be somewhat odd to have one policy instrument at odds with the wider European Green Deal, I think.
Yep. Maarten Pieter, would you want to respond to this?
Yeah, well, I think it's clear that I think it's not at odds with the Green Deal. But on the merger efficiencies, and I mentioned something in the beginning already, I think the conditions there, so the four cumulative conditions on the 1013 are very similar, if not identical, to get an efficiency, to make an efficiency defense in merger control. If we would also stretch, so as Nicole now proposes, I understand, also stretch the compensation criterion there. By that we mean that fair share is not full compensation of the consumers, but is ultimately in taking into account also the benefits of the merger in this case, and the green benefits of the merger, sustainability benefits for non-consumers, so for non-buyers, then my objection to that, both in merger control and also in 1013 application, so that's the proposal of the Dutch Competition Authority, mind you. It's a very advanced, I think, far out proposal. But so what that does is ultimately makes it very, very hard for the Competition Authority to say no. Because now you're going to take the willingness to pay for the sustainability benefits into account of everybody. Oh, my light goes off here. Wait. Excuse me. My university tries to save energy, which is a good thing. So now you're going to take everybody's willingness to pay into account. So that means that there's always going to be people out there that not buy the product that care a lot about the benefits. And so it's going to be very hard for the price increase that the buyers of the product pay. It's going to be very hard to say no, because there's always going to be compensation with others added to the benefit side, if you understand what I mean. And what that also does is it will put the competition authority in a political position of having to make a decision about welfare distribution ultimately, because the consumers of the product are going to suffer. They're going to pay a higher price, and they don't really appreciate very much, a little bit, but not fully compensating the green that's being put in place. And that's to the benefit of people who do not buy the product, that will then add on the benefit, be added on the benefit side. So that will be a welfare redistribution function, which is really not something that the competition authority should do. There's all sorts of difficult decisions there to make. And plus, it's going to be very hard to say no. So I think that would be a bad idea to go down that route. Competition authority, if it wants to go this way, it should rather be at least able to be strict.
Thank you. I wanted to turn to our questions from the audience. And I see the first question is a nice way to open up the debate, also to look at the effects of this on the general competitiveness of the EU. But what kind of rules should the EU impose to the third country companies active or willing to be active in the single market? Are there any candidates to take this question?
That's a question for Bartek, I think.
Alexander, do you want to take it?
Well, I mean, we have, I think, explained in fairly great detail what our proposals there would be. We have in the Commission seen quite a long time ago already the need to take into account typically subsidies for companies from third countries operating in our single market. I think this is a very important level playing field issue, and we have put our ideas on paper. I think the reception was very good, and now the next steps will follow. There's of course also the screening of foreign direct investment. It's not something that the Commission does; it's something that member states do. But also there, we have suggested that a high degree of coordination should take place. So I think the background to this question is a very good one. It's a very valid one, and it also shows that certain challenges which the European economy is facing, without any doubt, are not to be solved or tackled by means of the EU competition rules, but by rules that are either in trade policy, countervailing duties, etc., investigations, WTO proceedings, and so on, or in new instruments like in the future subsidy control vis-a-vis third countries. So I think I'm very happy about this question because it really shows the two dimensions or the multiple dimensions of global competitiveness and the right instruments to choose for each and every challenge that we face. So I think that's all I have to say to this.
Yep. And any idea when the next steps would come in this foreign subsidies discussion?
I don't have the timeline here with me. I think discussions have started, but I couldn't tell you when they would conclude.
Okay, thanks. Let's turn to another question. There are quite some about energy and environment guidelines. Here's a rather popular one. Why did the European Commission rush to adopt guidelines on state aid for indirect ETS costs? Wouldn't it be better to wait until details and objectives of the Green Deal were final? Alexander, I think we'll have to turn to you again on this one because
Sorry, I heard some other voices in the background. Is that relevant for us or? No.
Sorry, I also just heard something. No. No, sorry, go ahead, Alexander.
No, I think the changes to the ETS guidelines that we have put forward are very important. And they're very important at this point in time. We have, as you know, captured better the sectors and the industry concerned by the risk of carbon leakage. And here we have this double objective. On the one hand, preventing carbon leakage, but on the other hand, of course, also preventing undue distortions of competition and making sure that competition really can play its role. It's actually linked, I think, to the first question as well, and to the ability of our system, our legal system, to accommodate various aspects of international competitiveness. So I think it's a good example of how we can, in a smart and targeted way, take into account problems that are real. These are not invented problems that are real, but in a way that is targeted, tailor-made, limited to the problem, and doesn't have negative spillover effects on other parts of the economy.
Marek, would you like to comment? Yep, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I was actually thinking about not exactly commenting on what Alexander said, but addressing maybe question number 3, because I was the one who raised the difference between SMEs, smaller companies, and big companies. And as far as I saw, question number 3 concerns that problem. So if you don't mind, I could say something about that
so question
issue.
Number 3 is: will the EAG guidelines recognize the crucial role? Wait, sorry, yeah.
No. Then the.
It just switched. Yeah. Is there any difference between small and large companies? Yeah. In the involvement of the EU Green Deal. What is the observable attitude of these two actors? Sorry, go ahead, Marek.
Yes, thank you. So, I mean, of course, I'm talking from Polish perspective. Perhaps it's not the same in other European countries, but from what I know, the thing with smaller companies is obviously they have. I was talking about access to capital, but maybe number 1 thing we should mention here is, obviously they have less resources, less smaller access or smaller help from, I don't know, lawyers, advisors. Very often, new legal obligations or administrative burdens are actually far, if I could say so, heavier. Subjectively they feel them, or they treat those new legal obligations as a heavier burden than the big companies. So obviously it will be, for many of them, it will be more difficult to adjust or to change the way they conduct their businesses. So it fits into the Green Deal or the new green economy that we would like to build in Europe. So it is a challenge. It is especially important for countries like Poland, where SMEs constitute something around 98 or 99% of all the companies in Poland, and I think around 50% of people work for those kind of companies. So it's more or less half of our labor market. So that's why, as I was saying before, we believe that maybe a bit more flexible approach as far as state aid is concerned should be taken with regard to smaller companies, because we believe it will be a challenge, or a bigger challenge for them than it is for the bigger companies.
I don't know if any of the other, Nicole or Martin Peter, if you still like to respond to some of the topics that were raised over the last questions, or otherwise we can turn to... Please do, Nicole. Yep.
Yeah, on smaller companies, I do think there is the issue about, having scope and confidence to collaborate. I mean, the reality is in many sectors, the initiative is exactly the same. In automotive, it's about electrification of vehicles. In retail, it's about reducing packaging. In the technology sector, it's about improving means of recycling, energy for waste initiatives, etc. So if everyone is doing their own fragmented initiatives, that might not be very efficient. And that's why I have a bit of a problem with what Martin Peter has to say about, competition rather than collaboration achieves greater sustainability objectives. I'm not sure we can say that as a general statement. And I think that's all the more true for SMEs, actually. And so I think the reason I go back to the Dutch guidance is, above all, the Dutch guidance tries to give comfort to companies that they will not be fined if they're pursuing a legitimate collaboration, and in particular, if they talk to the authority about it. And the German authority has said it's been approached time and again by companies, and it's been able to give soft comfort or maybe amend their initiatives in some ways so it's as least as restrictive as it can be. And I think this is needed, because actually at the moment companies tell us that competition law is a barrier to achieving this massive amount of private investment that we require.
Thanks. Martin Peter, go ahead.
Of course, we have to be careful what companies say. I think what the Bundeskartellamt has said, and that was also initially the response of the Dutch competition authority, is that there is discretion for competition authorities not to enforce. But what's going on now, it goes way beyond that. So the guidelines of the Dutch Competition Authority are clear welcoming of all sorts of sustainability agreements by stretching this compensation criteria. And that is, I think, a couple of bridges, if not too far. And also what we should keep into mind is how did these things come into the world in the Netherlands? There were small initiatives by companies that wanted to do something that turned out to be a very small amount of green for a large amount of price increase. Chicken of Tomorrow case and the coal case. And why weren't they regulated? Because the Dutch government didn't want to regulate these matters. So there's another important risk apart from the greenwashing risk. By opening up the competition law this far, there's also another important risk to the policy, and that is that it discourages government regulation, which is the better route. Because government can now point, there's all sorts of reasons why governments don't regulate often, but governments can now point to supposed collective self-regulation and then again do nothing. So the whole track is wrong. It would be much better if the competition authorities would refer these proposals then to the government. Government can then go and with the great ideas of the associations that always, I'm sure, know better how to green their own production techniques, with those great initiatives, come to some regulation that's then vertically implemented without the need to eliminate competition, which is really not helping.
Thank you. I think we're about We're about 5:30, so I think we'll leave it here on this note. Thank you very much, everyone. I think we heard the positions on a wide range of topics, and I'm sure they will be treated much more in depth on the 4th of February when the Commission is holding its event on the topic. Let me thank Nicole, Marek, Maarten, Pieter, and Alexander for being on our panel today, and thank our audience for following along and sending such interesting questions. Thanks also to our partner, Business Science Poland, for making this event possible. And please feel free to send us feedback at events@politico.eu. Politico will continue hosting more virtual newsmaker interviews and panel discussions in the coming weeks, bringing its high-quality journalism and convening power to your screens at home or at work. Check our future events on politico.eu/events/future-events. Thank you very much.